Story time with Stephanie Story.
I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Story Time. I am really honored to have my guest here today. She's had a long time tech career in business, but her memoir that just came out on June 2nd, 2020, is called Say I'm Dead, a Family Memoir of Race, Secrets, and Love. It is a fascinating story that covers all kinds of topics. Obviously, race is at the center of it, so we're going to talk about that and about what she's witnessed, changes in history on that front in the United States. And we're going to talk about all kinds of other things. And if you want to learn more about her, please go to our website, edoloresjohnson.com. I'll put the link in below. Welcome to the show, Dolores Johnson. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm happy to be here, Stephanie. Thank you for having me.
So before we start anything, can you please tell my viewers at home a little bit about your book and the story of your memoir?
Say I'm Dead, a family memoir of race, secrets, and love is the true story of generations in my family who overcame fear, secrets, and separation because they refused to be bound by America's prohibitive anti-race mixing laws and norms. And through the journey of these several generations, you'll see how each in their own way dealt with the racism and the restrictions of their day. It's a slice of America's racial history that some people don't know much about.
Okay, your parents were interracial, right?
Yes. My father is Black, my mother is white. My parents met at work in 1942 in Indianapolis, Indiana. He was the handyman and she was the mail clerk. And he was sent down to her mailroom to build some shelves for her to store the boxes and supplies on.
How did you first go on this journey to go sort of looking into your parents' history? Because that's a fascinating part of this.
I was raised as a Black person, which was the only option when I was born in 1948. On my birth certificate, it said Negro without any recognition of my mother's white blood. And so we lived in a Black neighborhood. I went to a Black college. I was always a Black person. And when the movie Roots came on television, it was a mini series, showed an African American who traced his family all the way back to Africa. I was electrified by the idea of knowing where your family actually comes from, because the Irish know, the Italians know, but the Black people don't, because their names and their ties and their families were all cut off during slavery. And I did a family genealogy chart by going to visit relatives and doing interviews and searching documents. And I built this chart that had 5 or 6 generations on it. And when I looked at it, was the first time that in my life, and I was in my 30s then and married, that it occurred to me my mother was my whole white family all by herself and had no branches on that tree. I had to understand what was going on there.
Okay, so what did you find out? Because that's a big mystery to go, wait, why doesn't it keep going backwards? So you did get to follow your dad's family back a little bit.
Well, yes, we actually traced our Black side back to Africa and the person who arrived here on a slave ship in Virginia.
Wow. Okay, so you get to actually trace the Black side of your family all the way back, which is interesting because that is the side of the family that's usually lost, right?
Yeah, and that's why it was so stunning to realize that my mom, who was American, had no family on that chart, and not only on the chart, but in our lives. We had never heard of them. We didn't know who they were. We didn't know where they lived. We had not ever talked about them. And it dawned on me that this was some sort of deep secret that had to be told.
Okay, I don't want to give too many spoiler alerts away for your memoir for the readers at home who are going to read it. But give us enough about what you are willing to share about what you discover on this journey about your mom's family so that they know what they're going to be reading about.
So in a family discussion that I asked for, I said, we have this great big genealogy chart, and guess what? We still don't know who we are because a big thing is missing from this chart. And everybody looked at me and said, what are you talking about? And I said, Mama's family is missing. The whole white family is missing. And after a lot of gnashing of teeth and very difficult emotional weekend of discussion, I said to my mom, you have to tell me what happened. And she and my dad went to the bedroom. They talked it over. I could hear her crying. And they finally came downstairs and told my brothers and I. In 1943, the situation in Indiana was so racist, we feared for our lives. There was an anti-miscegenation law in that state, which said that if a black and a white married, they would have to go to prison for 7 years, man and woman. The Klan was very well represented in the city council of Indianapolis. And as a matter of fact, some years before, there had been a governor in Indianapolis who was the grand wizard of the entire national organization of the Ku Klux Klan. And prior to them meeting, there had been a lynching of 2 men in Indiana. And my father told my mom, look, we cannot do this. This is very, very dangerous. We can't be together unless we leave here. And as the story unfolds, my mom and dad tell us that they fled Indiana in secret, separately. They went to Buffalo, New York, where they were married legally, and they lived in hiding from her family and the authorities for 36 years. Even the FBI was called in to look for my mom, and they never found her.
Because they thought she had.
The police in Indianapolis, and because she got on a train, she told her dad she was going to visit someone in Massachusetts, and she traveled through several states. That's interstate commerce. And so when the Indianapolis police turned up nothing, the FBI was called in to go across all those states. And then they ended up in New York City because she had sent a postcard home from Manhattan, although she was going on to Buffalo, saying she was having a great time, just to kind of throw them off and say goodbye. And the New York City detectives, after collecting all the information from these authorities, had my grandfather come in, and they told him that they were closing the case and labeling it a victim of foul play, which meant that my mom was considered either murdered or sold into white slavery. And that's what her family lived with all those years that she was missing.
Okay, so wait, so before I ask about the emotional impact this had on you, because I want to hear about that, what's the end of the story? Did your mom end up reconnecting with her family ever, or did they not? Or do you want to wait and make people read the book?
Yeah. So what happened was that I told my mom, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go find these people. And she was very upset. She said, I can't deal with it. I don't want to face them. I'm so ashamed of, how they must have been hurt. I feel guilty. They're not going to accept me back. So if you go looking for them and you should find them, tell them, just say I'm dead. That's the title of the book. So I did go and I did search for them. And what I'll say is that there was a lot of anguish and some resolution, but you have to read the book to find out exactly.
Exactly. When you first got this information from your mom, what did it do to you emotionally and psychologically? Because that's like a big family secret. There are smaller family secrets. This is a pretty big family secret.
There were two major secrets that actually went on during the investigation of my family's genealogy. The first one had to do with my father's side. And that was, I traveled down to Alabama to meet this great aunt. She was this ancient old lady. I'd heard of her, but I'd never met her. And we're going through this shoebox of pictures, and she's telling me who all these relatives are that I've never really understood how I'm related to. I've heard their names, and they live in other states. And we lay all this out on her dining room table until we get the generations. And she pulls out a picture from this box of my grandmother, who was about the same age in the picture as I was on that visit. And she says to me, "Look at this. You two are the spitting image of each other. You know, you both have that white side." And I said to her, "What white side?" She said, "They didn't tell you? Your grandma's half white." Well, this had never been told to me. No one ever spoke of it. I had no idea. So I said, well, what do you mean? What happened? And she said, well, her mom was named Pearl, and she worked on the plantation where her ancestors had been slaves and was repeatedly raped by this white man who ran the farm. And she became pregnant by him. And I said, well, she must have been so ashamed she didn't tell me. She said, what would she have to be ashamed about, Dolores? That's what white men did to Black women. They could do anything they wanted, and we couldn't do a thing about it. She said Francis was only about 15 when he did that to her. And I asked, well, did my grandmother know her dad? She said, yeah. Occasionally, he came by the house where she lived with a little bag of candy and sat her on his lap. But when he crossed over that porch and went to his house, everybody knew that those children were never to acknowledge that they knew he was a relative. And that's how it was in the South. I still feel a great disgust to know that that rapist blood is running in my veins. So that was the first very emotional surprise. And then the second was when my mother and father told us how they ran away. And the secret that there was a family, we had all these relatives. When I had been raised as a Black person and had experienced tremendous racism in my life, I just couldn't pull the pieces of that puzzle together without seeing those people, those white people, to know what kind of people were they? What did they look like? What kind of work did they did? What were their values? I wanted to know. And it was extremely emotional. As I said, my mom was upset, very upset for months. My dad was upset. One of my brothers, who was a Black militant, ran the Juneteenth festival for Buffalo, wore a dashiki all the time. He told me I was a race traitor. What do you want with chasing after these white people? The last thing they want to know is that there's an N-word on the porch claiming to be a relative. They're going to shut the door in your face. You're so foolish to go after this. And my older brother was the total opposite, who we felt sometimes passed for white. He had a white wife and lived on the other side of town, and we saw him only at holidays. He said he didn't want any part of it. So it was just an emotional breakdown for all of us.
Did you read that New York Times piece about the woman who was talking about the rape in her history? And
My body is a Confederate monument.
That was extraordinarily a moving story that completely changed the way I thought of it. It was honestly, I'm going to admit my own ignorance, it was honestly the first time I thought about the history of rape and what has to be so many African American and Black people's experience in their lineage through this.
It's so common that if you consider the shades of brown and Black in African Americans, you can understand that they're all mixed, because Africans are Black. We don't have that many African Americans that are Black. We have cinnamon and caramel and nutmeg and tan. Those are all signals of rape, because the first instantiation of mixed race was in slavery.
Of course.
The first boat of slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619. That's 150 years before the establishment of the United States. The cotton economy, the tobacco, the sugar that was being produced on those vast plantations were all free labor. Anyone who knows anything about running a business knows that the very biggest expense is the payroll. Yet those white planters had no payroll for 400 years. Not only did they enslave these people, take all their opportunity to grow wealth and families, splitting up families, selling off children and relatives, but they raped the women constantly. And the product is this chalk to charcoal range of colors in America. The famous race scholar Henry Louis Gates says that even the blackest, the darkest African American, according to DNA testing, is 12% white.
And that point that any shading is it's a sign of rape. It's just so stark to me. How did you handle that emotional, you said it was an emotional reaction, but then you moved on to the other story. How did you handle that?
The rape story?
Taking that in, yeah.
The rape story.
Yeah.
Well, I was horrified that had happened to my great-grandmother, first of all, a forcible rape that I'm told was repeated and repeated and repeated. And that my grandmother lived with that and never spoke of it. What must she have suffered having a father that wouldn't acknowledge her in public, who had raped her mother and yet had the nerve to come and visit her with a piece of candy as if she should receive him? When my grandmother left Georgia in the middle of the night with her son, my dad, she told us she escaped from Georgia. She escaped. And she was part of the Great Migration, in which the African Americans left the South, where they had been predominant in the planter years of slavery, and they spread out all over the United States. Did you ever wonder, how did Black people get to Seattle or Chicago or San Francisco or Boston? They all escaped the Jim Crow racism of the South. And Jim Crow was the period when informal laws and norms were in place that were designed to keep Black people down in servitude by fear, by terror, by rejection. And that was the atmosphere and the era in which my parents met, when those laws said you could never intermarry. The idea was that white women represented the purity of the race. So no Black man could ever touch a white woman. Even little Emmett Till at 14 went to Mississippi to visit relatives. And when he said something to a white woman he passed on the sidewalk, he was murdered. His eyes were gouged out. His head was beaten to disfigurement. He was drowned at 14. Yet, white people meted that out on Black men who in any way interacted with white women, anyway. Yet white men could rape Black women anytime, as much as they wanted to, with zero consequences.
It's an extraordinary, really difficult, impossible part of American history that I have a really hard time coping with in a mental capacity. And
we all do.
and we are seeing this new moment after George Floyd was murdered, and we've had these moments in our racial history as a country. Are you hopeful that this is going to be a moment, or are you skeptical that it's not?
I was a college student, a sophomore in college, when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I saw the riots that went on all over the country. I was in Washington, D.C., and the city was just like the George Floyd riots, except that the entire city burned. We stood on the roof of the dorm and watched the orange blaze engulf seas of property in Washington, D.C. And so it was in almost all the major cities in the United States. So I've seen this rage before. And I watched Rodney King get beaten. We've all seen that video where 5 policemen beat him on the ground with batons in 1993, I think it was. And then we've seen, an innumerable list of names of unarmed Black people who've been killed by the police. And all of that came out following the George Floyd death, starting with Trayvon Martin in 2013. Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging in Georgia and was shot to death. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old who was playing in the park with a toy gun, shot to death by the police. Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray. It goes on and on and on. And during that period, in the last, say, 6 to 10 years, when those killings have taken place, people have been outraged where has not been any outburst, as we saw after George Floyd. But his was just the pot boiling over. We've had it, all of this abuse for years and years boiled over. Now, your question is, where do we go from here? There have to be a lot of significant changes in the United States to rectify what people are so angry about. The police brutality is only the first step, and the riots, in my opinion, are only awareness raising. That's the voice of the voiceless. They're not in Congress. They're not at the top of the corporations. They're not in the seats of power and money that can make those things happen. They can only say, look, this has got to change. And that's the way riots look to me. So are the people in the positions of power actually going to look into the changes? We've had people make donations. That's good. But it's so much deeper than that. It's so much deeper than that. People don't know the history, just as you were saying, some of the things that I talked about you hadn't heard of. And why is that? The textbooks in America don't teach this history. Slavery is a couple of paragraphs. It was this bad thing. They had it in the South. There was a Civil War, and it's over. That's how kids are educated. That is not the story. The story is the vast deprivation of Black people. And it's the Jim Crow keeping people down in menial jobs and not letting them get educated and so much more. And where we are today compared to, let's say, 1954, when Brown v. Board of Education went to the Supreme Court. That was the decision that desegregated American schools. Prior to that, we had a law called Separate but Equal, which said the Blacks and whites are to be separated. This is a segregated country. That was the law. But the case was that no, it's not equal, because the Black schools, the buildings are dilapidated. There's not enough books to go around. The kids have to walk to school. There's no bus, all of that. Today, there was an analysis by Harvard Law School that showed, so this is 70 years since that decision. Today, American schools are more segregated than they were in 1954.
Right? I feel that. I'm from the South. We're talking about people. I was educated in public schools in Arkansas.
So you know the Brown v. Board, Central High and all that, right?
That's right. I was educated 60 miles from there. So this problem is still prevalent in this town. Go ahead. It's amazing.
So the reason that the education is still so segregated is because of housing policies in the United States. First, there was redlining. Once people got into Jim Crow and they started coming out of that a little bit, where they could get a job at the post office or as a school teacher and begin to enter the middle class, banks and realtors colluded to keep Blacks from moving into middle class neighborhoods. So they kept them in ghettos by refusing mortgages. And that happened all over America. And of course, there were fights in all kinds of neighborhoods when a Black family would try to integrate. And you'll see in my book, Say I'm Dead, that our family moved into a neighborhood that was aspirational for us. My mom wanted to live there because there was this big public park and we would have some fresh air and greenery around us. And she was so excited when they bought that home, the only home my parents ever had. And they saved for 15 years to buy that house. And after we moved in, the neighborhood started to change. So what happened was the white people all fled. I went in that neighborhood in 5th grade, and by the time I graduated 8th grade, 5th grade, there were a scattering of Black kids. 8th grade, there was one white person left, one white student in the whole school. Everybody left. And then what did the city do? Oh, well, the white people are in the suburbs and they have to go to work downtown, so we need to build an expressway so they can get there. So they ripped up that park, that public park, that green section of town that we lived by in order to make a highway for the suburbanites. So white people left and didn't come back. And so because we don't have housing policies that foster integrated neighborhoods, then we have separate schools. And we have continuing race disparities of medical clinics that are inferior, schools that are inferior, food deserts, all of that in these neighborhoods. That's all to be fixed if we are going to stop having riots and make real progress.
So knowing all of the enormously systemic problems that are underlying all of this, does this moment make you hopeful that we have a chance of overcoming that, or still skeptical that it's too embedded in American culture to make the changes that we're going to have to make? I just can't. I waffle between being hopeful and terrified that it's not going to work again.
In the context of my book, Say I'm Dead, mm-hmm. let me answer you that way. I conclude the book with my grandson, who's mixed race. He's just 1 year old, and he is a statistics. According to the Census Bureau in 2010, the last count that was done in America, the growth rate for mixed race children outstrips the growth rate for single race children 3-1. In 2015, they reported that 1 in 10 marriages in this country are mixed race. That means all races, not just Black and white. Everybody marrying everybody. And their projection shows that by mid-century, 20% of America will be mixed race. That is a bigger number than the Hispanic population is today. So I look at mixed race and I say there's hope there. People are learning to love each other, to create families together, making the biggest decisions of their life together across the racial line. And there's going to be more and more and more of it. That's a positive in my mind. Yet, the Black Lives Matter movement has this enormous agenda, as we just talked about. And the mobilization of people behind policy change and structural change is huge, as you point out. But I think that progress will be made. But in my opinion, if you look at the trajectory of America's race history, you start with slavery, the total subjugation of Black people and Indians, I'll point out. Indians were made into slaves in this country. If they weren't exterminated, they were slaves. You go from that to Jim Crow, which is a suppression of progress. You go from that to mass incarceration, which was invented by the federal government, who criminalized the drugs that were popular with Black people, but not cocaine that white people took. So that the unbalanced distribution of, quote, justice caused law enforcement to round up every Black and brown person that had a joint, while white people were snorting coke and still walking around. So now you have this criminalization of Black people. Again, there's no progress, no way to get out of that. You're in jail, and what are you going to do? And now you have this racial reckoning. To me, it's like inch, inch, inch towards progress. Yet progress has been made because I grew up in an impoverished home and rose to become a vice president in a Fortune 100 company and lived in Europe. So I know what Black people can do. I know how smart and wonderful they are, but America doesn't seem to know that. One of the solutions that I suggest to people often is to get to know people on the other side of the race line intimately. Reach out beyond yourself, invite a fresh air kid in the summer to spend 2 weeks at your house. Import some Black kids to spend the night over with your kids. Go find a Black dentist or an accountant to do your taxes. Make some effort to cross the line and get to know each other, because those people who are meeting each other and marrying across the race line have proven we're all human. We want the same thing. We want to be respected for our humanity, our intelligence, our character, and we want to be loved. So, it's individual work as well as massive policy work.
And I didn't get to ask you about, you're Harvard educated, you've had this giant career, you have done all of these amazing things. You mentioned it a little bit, just because I don't want to close without asking you about it. What perspective has this sort of success, people, what did that give you as a writer? What do you think?
I spent almost 30 years in tech, and then I went on after that to do a special project on presidential papers for the Library of Congress. And in all of that, I learned how to communicate messages very clearly, because in business, everything is like quick, do yesterday. No extra words, just get to the point. And organization, because there was a lot of project management that I did, which is pulling in huge numbers of individuals and departments and partners to create something that can be made and distributed and sold worldwide. And that's what I did. And of course, when I decided to write, I had never done it until I was in my 60s. And I wanted to write this story because I was around a bunch of journalists on my career road who talked to me all the time about investigative journalism and research. And as we got to know each other, they would ask me about my background. And when I told them my parents' story, they were like, "Oh, you have to write a book. You have to write a book." And I thought, okay, well, I should write a book. And so I sat down, and just like business, I sat down, I just wrote it. And I gave it to a creative writing teacher, who gave it back to me and said, "You know what you have here, Dolores, is a business report." She said, "You don't know anything about creative writing." And when she explained to me what I didn't know, she was right. So I went back to school and learned, took a 1-year MFA equivalent class at that point to learn how to write. But I think that the flip of my brain from completely analytical, looking at balance sheets and sales projections and budgets and all that stuff, and Gantt charts, to creating scenes and dialogue and description was like a complete flip, analytical to creative. It took me a while to really, change the way I approach my communications. And I had to learn all those techniques. But the central thread between analytics and creativity for me was organization. Knowing how to take this massive amount of information that you want to put into a book and eventually trim all the tangents so that you stick to the point and pull the thread from point A to the end took a lot of organization. And one of the ways I did that was using color-coded 3x5 cards, where I put every scene on a different card, and they were on a card that was color-coded to the person that scene centered on. So I could see how I was balancing my mom, myself, my daughter, my grandson, and flashbacks were different color, flash forward. So the organization was the commonality.
One last question though. Now that you've done both, you've done the business, analytical, tech side, you've done all of that, and now you've done the more creative outlet of writing a memoir. Which one at this point in your life do you like better?
I like writing better. I like writing better. It's a lot of fun when I'm at the keyboard. If I'm not crying, I'm laughing. Mostly really happy to see what I can produce and how I can pull it all together. Business was very, very hectic. And because I had international clients, I had people in 28 countries. I was on a plane in a different time zone all the time. I was a single mom because my husband died very early. And it was highly stressful. But writing is on my schedule and it's my choice rather than what has to be done to make all of the departments and all of the customers and all the shareholders happy. Is what I want to do.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Storey.